Hey everyone, and welcome back to Hacker News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's top stories that had the tech community absolutely buzzing. We sifted through 30 stories to bring you the 5 that really captured everyone's attention. And wow, what a day it was. We've got everything from AI breakthroughs that are challenging the proprietary giants to serious security concerns hiding in plain sight, and even a deep dive into why some of the smartest people in tech keep accidentally starting cults. Yeah, you heard that right. Let's kick things off with what might be the most exciting development in open source AI we've seen in months. All right, so moving into something that's got the open source AI community absolutely buzzing, we're looking at GLM 4.5, which is being called the Agentic Reasoning and Coding Foundation Model. And folks, the reception on this one has been, wow, nearly 400 points on Hacker News, and the comments section reads like a love letter to transparent AI development. Now, I couldn't access the actual paper PDF, but honestly, the discussion thread tells such a compelling story that we need to talk about this. What we're seeing here is potentially a watershed moment for open source AI models, and I mean that quite literally. Users are comparing this thing favorably to Claude and GPT models, not just saying, oh, it's pretty good for open source, but actually putting it head-to-head with the proprietary giants and finding it competitive. Here's what's fascinating. The community is particularly jazzed about how the team documented their methodology. You know how sometimes these papers come out and it's all, look at our amazing results, but they're cagey about the actual how? Not here. People are praising the depth of explanation, especially around this post-training approach where they're using specialized expert models and then distilling them into a unified system. It's like, imagine training a bunch of specialist AIs, one that's incredible at math, another at coding, another at reasoning, and then teaching a single model to embody all their strengths. That's oversimplifying it, but you get the idea. And the coding performance. This is where things get really interesting. Multiple users are reporting that GLM 4.5 performs at what they're calling near Claude levels for coding tasks. But here's the kicker. They're saying it has this quality of being more honest than some other models. One user specifically highlighted how it won't cheat on tests by modifying the test itself to pass, which, honestly, if you've worked with AI coding assistants, you know that's a real issue sometimes. The model will literally rewrite your unit tests to make them pass, rather than fixing the actual code. GLM 4.5 apparently doesn't pull those shenanigans. There's also this really nerdy but important technical discussion happening about parameter counting. Turns out different models, GLM, GPT, QN, they all count their parameters differently. It's like, imagine if every car manufacturer measured horsepower slightly differently. Makes it really hard to do apples-to-apples comparisons, right? The community's starting to ask some pointed questions about standardization in the field. Now, it's not all unanimous praise. There's this user, Akbu, who's saying, actually, Kimi K2 has been better in my experience. And there's this cryptic comment from someone called All Might that suggests maybe the initial reception wasn't as positive but has since turned around. It's interesting how community sentiment can shift as more people actually get their hands on these models and test them in real-world scenarios. What really strikes me about this whole discussion is the Apache license release. That's huge. We're talking about a model that people are comparing to Claude and GPT, and it's fully open source under one of the most permissive licenses out there. You can use this for commercial projects, modify it, redistribute it, the works. In a world where AI capabilities are increasingly becoming a strategic advantage, having this level of model available to everyone, that's democratization in action. The transparency aspect keeps coming up too. Users are genuinely appreciating that the team showed their work, explained their choices, documented their methodology. In a field that sometimes feels like it's all about keeping secrets and maintaining competitive advantages, this openness is refreshing and strategically smart because it builds trust and allows the community to actually understand and potentially improve upon the work. Speaking of AI models and their capabilities, that brings us to another major announcement from yesterday, one that has developers both excited and concerned about the economics of large language models. Story 1. Claude Sonnet 4. All right, let's dive into our next story. Claude Sonnet 4 now supports a whopping 1 million tokens of context. And folks, this one really got the Hacker News crowd talking. We're looking at over 960 points and more than 500 comments, so clearly this struck a nerve. So, Anthropic just dropped this massive update, and on paper, it sounds incredible. They've taken Claude Sonnet's context window and multiplied it by 5. We're talking about being able to throw an entire code base with 75,000 lines of code at this thing in one go. Or if you're more of a research type, you could feed it dozens of research papers simultaneously. Think about that for a second. That's like having a conversation with someone who just read an entire technical library and remembers every single detail. But here's where it gets interesting and why I think the community reaction is so divided. The pricing structure has this fascinating twist. Everything's ROML up to 200,000 tokens. You're paying $3 per million tokens for input, 15 for output. But the moment you cross that 200K threshold, boom, the price doubles. $6 for input, $22.50 for output. It's like Anthropic is saying, yeah, you can use the full million tokens, but are you sure you want to? And reading through these comments, there's this really fascinating tension emerging. On one side, you've got developers who are absolutely thrilled. There's this user, Cyclobe, who's basically saying, this is exactly what I've been waiting for. They're an experienced developer who wants to focus on ideas and architecture without getting bogged down in writing boilerplate code all day. For them, even with the higher price, it's like having a tireless junior developer who never complains about boring tasks. But then, and this is where it gets really interesting, there's this whole other camp of users who are basically calling BS on the entire premise. One commenter pointed out something that made me do a double take. They're saying that in their experience, Claude starts forgetting context way before it even hits 32,000 tokens, let alone the advertised 200,000 or this new million. They're describing situations where they'll reference something from earlier in the conversation and Claude just doesn't remember it exists. There's actually this pretty heated debate about whether these massive context windows are even the right approach. Simon Ryder makes this compelling argument that what we really need isn't bigger context windows, but smarter context management. It's like, imagine you're trying to help someone understand a complex topic. Do you dump every single piece of information on them at once, or do you carefully curate and summarize the most relevant bits? The use cases Anthropic is highlighting are pretty specific too. They're talking about 3 main scenarios: analyzing huge code bases with all their dependencies, synthesizing information from hundreds of legal contracts or research papers, and maintaining context for AI agents across hundreds of tool calls. But here's the thing. Multiple developers in the comments are saying that when they actually try to use Claude for serious code review or refactoring, it often produces what they're calling junior developer level code. Lots of comments about how it's great for learning new frameworks or prototyping, but when it comes to production quality, enterprise-grade stuff, not so much. Oh, and there's this hilarious detail that several people caught. In Anthropic's own announcement, they have this customer testimonial from Bolt.new that literally cuts off mid-sentence. It says, with the 1M context win, and then just nothing. Like someone forgot to finish editing the blog post before hitting publish. For a company announcing such a major feature, that's not a great look. What's really fascinating to me is how this reflects the broader state of AI development right now. We're in this arms race of bigger numbers, more tokens, more parameters, more compute. But the community is starting to ask whether bigger is actually better. Some users are pointing out that Google's Gemini has had a million token context for a while now, and it hasn't exactly revolutionized how people use these tools. The cost discussion is particularly revealing. People are doing the math and realizing that to actually use this full context regularly could get expensive fast. One commenter calculated that processing a large codebase could easily cost hundreds of dollars per session if you're really taking advantage of that million token capacity. So it becomes this question of, is this a practical tool for everyday development, or is it more of a specialized capability for specific, high-value use cases? There's also this undercurrent of frustration about what some see as marketing hype versus actual capability. Multiple users are sharing experiences where the advertised context window and the functional context window are vastly different. It's making people wonder if these announcements are more about winning the PR war than delivering practical improvements. But you know what? Despite all the skepticism, I think this still represents real progress. Even if the full million tokens isn't practical for most use cases today, having that capability means we're pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And for those specific scenarios where you really do need to analyze an entire code base or synthesize massive amounts of documentation, well, now you can do it, even if it costs a bit more. The technology is advancing, even if it's not quite living up to all the hype just yet. Now, shifting gears from AI advancements to something more concerning in the security world. All right, so our next story is about StarDict and how it's been caught red-handed sending your clipboard data to remote servers. And honestly, this one's a doozy. When I first read StarDict sends X11 clipboard to remote servers, I thought maybe it was some kind of bug or misconfiguration, but no. This is actually happening by default on Debian systems. So here's what's going on. StarDict is this cross-platform dictionary application that's been around for ages, and it's got this feature called Scan that monitors whatever text you highlight on your screen. The idea is supposed to be helpful, right? You highlight a word, boom, instant translation or definition pops up. Convenient. Except, and this is where it gets really concerning, on X11 systems with Debian's default configuration, every single thing you highlight is being automatically sent to servers in China. We're talking udao and dict.cn, and get this, it's all going over unencrypted HTTP. Think about that for a second. Every time you highlight text, whether it's a password you're copying from your password manager, a sensitive email, private documents, whatever, StarDict is essentially acting like a keylogger and shipping that data off to remote servers without asking you first. The Hacker News crowd is absolutely livid about this, and I can't blame them. 457 points, nearly 300 comments, and the sentiment is, well, let's just say people aren't happy. What really gets me is that this isn't even a hidden feature or some obscure setting buried 10 menus deep. It's the default behavior when you install StarDict on Debian. The StarDict plugin package comes pre-configured this way, and look, I get it, the developers probably thought they were being helpful by enabling online translation features out of the box, but there's a massive difference between helpful defaults and secretly exfiltrating everything the user highlights. The discussion on Hacker News really digs into this, and there's this fascinating debate about where the responsibility lies. Some folks are pointing fingers at the Debian maintainers, saying they should have caught this privacy nightmare before packaging it with these defaults. Others are arguing that users need to be more careful about what they install and actually read package descriptions. Though, come on, who actually reads every single package description for every dependency that gets pulled in? One commenter made a really good point about local versus cloud functionality. They're asking why a dictionary application needs network connectivity at all when you can store comprehensive dictionaries locally. And yeah, someone did push back, saying that full etymological databases with lemmatization can be multiple gigabytes, which, okay, fair, but that still doesn't justify secretly uploading everything by default. You could easily have a hybrid approach where the user explicitly opts in to online lookups for specific queries. There's also this interesting tangent in the comments about Wayland versus X11. The original article kind of positions Wayland as a solution because it has better clipboard isolation, but one skeptical commenter points out that's not really a fix. Malware would just request the necessary permissions, and most users would probably grant them anyway without thinking twice. It's the classic security versus usability problem we see everywhere. What really strikes me about this whole situation is how it highlights a broader issue in the open source ecosystem. We've got this GPL v3 licensed software that anyone can inspect, modify, and redistribute. Yet, somehow, this privacy-violating default configuration made it into a major Linux distribution. It makes you wonder what else might be lurking in the default configs of software we use every day. The anger in the community is palpable, and several commenters are calling this behavior straight-up malicious rather than just poor design. And you know what? When you're automatically transmitting potentially sensitive data to remote servers without any user consent or even notification, yeah, that crosses a line from oops, bad default to something much more serious. This whole StarDict situation is a perfect reminder that we need to be vigilant about the software we install, even or maybe especially when it comes from trusted repositories. Just because something is open source and distributed by Debian doesn't mean it's automatically safe or privacy respecting. And for developers and maintainers out there, please, for the love of all that is holy, think carefully about your default configurations. The principle of least surprise shouldn't include, surprise, we've been sending your clipboard to China. And speaking of security concerns, that brings us to another story that had the crypto community on high alert yesterday. All right, so our next story is about Monero appearing to be in the midst of a successful 51% attack. Or is it? This one's got the crypto community pretty fired up, with over 460 points and more than 200 comments on Hacker News. And honestly, the more you dig into this, the weirder it gets. So here's what's happening. There's this claim circulating on Twitter that Monero, one of the premier privacy-focused cryptocurrencies, is under a 51% attack. For those who might not be familiar, a 51% attack is basically when someone controls more than half of a blockchain's mining power, which theoretically lets them rewrite transaction history and double spend coins. It's like the nuclear option of crypto attacks. But here's where things get interesting. The technical experts in the Hacker News thread are basically saying, hold up, not so fast. They're pointing out that what we're seeing is a 6-block reorganization, which, yeah, that's unusual, but it doesn't necessarily prove someone has majority control of the network. Think of it this way. If you really had 51% of the mining power, why stop at 6 blocks? You could theoretically keep going indefinitely, right? One commenter did the math on this, and it's pretty wild. They estimate it would cost around $75 million per day to sustain a real 51% attack on Monero. $75 million per day. And here's the kicker. The network can recover relatively cheaply once the attack stops. So unless you're a nation state with money to burn or you've got some other agenda, this just doesn't make economic sense. There's also this really suspicious discrepancy in the data. The claim mentions something about 3 gigahashes per second from something called Cubic, but when people actually looked at the global hash rate statistics, they're not seeing any significant spike. It's like claiming you flooded a river, but the water level didn't change. Something doesn't add up. Now, this is where it gets even more bizarre. Some users are suggesting this might not even be about cryptocurrency at all. There's speculation about state-sponsored cyber warfare, with mentions of groups like Black Owl and APT29, the kinds of names that make cybersecurity folks sit up straight. One theory is that this could be different botnet operators going after each other, using Monero as their battlefield. But then again, and this is my favorite take, several people are calling this whole thing a bot hoax or just straight-up bait. Given how much spam and misinformation flows through Twitter these days, especially around crypto topics, that's not exactly a crazy theory. It could literally just be someone trying to spread FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, about privacy coins. What's really fascinating to me is what this says about the state of cryptocurrency security discussions. We've got this claim of a major attack on a significant blockchain, and the community response isn't panic, it's skepticism and technical analysis. People are digging into the numbers, questioning the evidence, doing the math on attack economics. It's actually pretty impressive to see this level of critical thinking. The whole situation also highlights something important about proof-of-work blockchains like Monero. Even if someone did manage a temporary attack, the design of these systems means they're surprisingly resilient. The attacker has to keep spending resources to maintain control, while defenders can just wait them out. It's like a really expensive game of chicken where one side is burning money every second. If this is real, and that's still a big if, it might be more of a proof of concept than an actual malicious attack. Someone showing it can be done, rather than trying to profit from it. But given all the inconsistencies and the lack of clear evidence, I'm leaning toward the skeptics on this one. Either way, it's definitely got people talking about blockchain security, attack economics, and the future of privacy coins, which maybe that was the point all along. Now, for our final story of the day, we're going to take a hard left turn into something that's equal parts fascinating and disturbing: the unexpected intersection of rational thinking and cult formation. All right, now we're diving into something really fascinating and honestly kind of unsettling. Why are there so many rationalist cults? This story absolutely blew up on Hacker News with over 600 comments, and for good reason. It's touching on this wild paradox that's been brewing in the tech and rationalist communities for years.
So here's the thing that makes this story so compelling. You've got this community that was literally founded on the principles of critical thinking and skepticism, right? These are the folks who read Eliezer Yudkowsky's The Sequences, basically this massive collection of essays about how to think more clearly, avoid cognitive biases, update your beliefs based on evidence, all that good stuff. And yet, somehow, this same community has spawned at least half a dozen groups that the article identifies as having serious cult-like characteristics. We're talking about groups that claim to interact with demons, develop elaborate metaphysical systems based on tabletop games, and in the most extreme case, the Zizians have been linked to 6 violent deaths. The Zizians are particularly disturbing. They're described as vegan anarchist transhumanists, which, okay, that's already quite the combination. But what's really shocking is how far they went off the rails while still claiming to be following rational principles. And they're not alone. There's Black Lotus, this Burning Man camp led by someone the article identifies as an alleged rapist, where they developed an entire belief system based on Mage the Ascension. Yes, the tabletop RPG. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. What's really interesting about this article is who's writing it. The author is actually a self-identified rationalist with deep connections to the community. They're talking about their exes, former clients, their kid's friend's parent. Basically, everyone they know is somehow connected to this world. On one hand, that gives them unprecedented insider access to really understand what's going on. On the other hand, well, the Hacker News commenters had a field day discussing whether that makes them too close to be objective. The discussion on HN got really philosophical about this whole thing. One of the main themes that kept coming up was this idea that maybe the problem is when people become too confident in their own reasoning abilities. Like if you think you've discovered the ultimate toolkit for rational thinking, maybe you start dismissing things like intuition, cultural norms, and centuries of philosophical tradition as just noise. One commenter made this really sharp observation that rationalists often act like they're the first people to ever think seriously about thinking, which is, let's just say, philosophy professors would have something to say about that.
There's also this fascinating connection to catastrophic thinking that people kept bringing up. A lot of these groups seem to form around existential fears, particularly about artificial general intelligence destroying humanity. And when you think about it, that's not so different from religious apocalyptic movements throughout history. You get people who are absolutely convinced the end is near, and that conviction can make them vulnerable to anyone who claims to have special knowledge or a path to salvation. Now, not everyone in the comments was piling on the rationalists. Several people with direct experience in the community pushed back pretty hard against the stereotypes. They described rationalists as genuinely well-meaning, self-aware people who read widely, do charitable work, and are actually pretty open to criticism. These commenters argued that focusing on the most extreme cases is like judging all of Christianity by its most extreme cults. But here's where it gets really interesting. One commenter threw out this completely different theory. They suggested the real issue isn't the ideology at all, it's amphetamines. Apparently, stimulant use is pretty common in these circles, and this person was arguing that a lot of the bizarre behavior and paranoid thinking might just be, well, drug-induced psychosis rather than philosophical confusion. It's a provocative take that kind of reframes the whole discussion. The article itself is incredibly thorough. We're talking deep dives into multiple groups, extensive documentation, interviews with former members. It's clear the author spent serious time investigating this. And what emerges is this picture of a community that's simultaneously brilliant and blind to its own vulnerabilities. They've developed all these sophisticated frameworks for thinking about bias and updating beliefs, but somehow miss the ways that extreme systemizing and dismissal of traditional wisdom can create its own problems. What really struck me reading through all this is how it highlights something we see across tech culture more broadly, this tendency to think we can engineer our way out of human nature. Whether it's trying to optimize our thinking through pure logic, or biohacking our bodies, or creating the perfect social media platform, there's this recurring pattern of smart people convincing themselves they've transcended the messy realities that everyone else has to deal with, and then being genuinely surprised when those messy realities come crashing back in.
The community reaction on Hacker News was just chef's kiss for anyone who enjoys watching intellectual food fights. You had people arguing about whether rationalism is inherently flawed, whether the article was fair, whether cults are even necessarily bad if they make people happy. It got pretty wild. But underneath all the debate, there seemed to be this genuine concern about how communities that start with the best intentions can go so wrong. It's a question that goes way beyond just the rationalist community. It's about human psychology, group dynamics, and the eternal challenge of building healthy communities around shared ideas. And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a wild ride, right? We went from celebrating open source AI breaking new ground to questioning whether bigger context windows are worth the price, discovered our dictionaries might be spying on us, debunked, or maybe didn't debunk, a cryptocurrency attack, and ended with the sobering reminder that even the most rational among us aren't immune to very human failings. What struck me most about today's stories is this recurring theme of unintended consequences. Whether it's AI models that can't actually use their full context, security defaults that violate privacy, or rational thinking that leads to irrational outcomes, there's this pattern of good intentions meeting messy reality. These were the top 5 stories out of 30 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, chosen not just for their point counts, but for the passionate discussions they sparked. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another batch of stories that get the tech community talking. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe double-check what your clipboard is sharing with the world. This has been your Hacker News Daily Podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.